Hey everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we'll go ahead and install the Splunk add-on for AWS. Now one of the prerequisites for this video, if you want to do it practically, is you will need a AWS account. Now let's say that you do not really have a AWS account, that is also fine. You can just go ahead and look into the video at a demo perspective because we'll be discussing about lot of important practical considerations related to Splunk add-ons. So first let's go ahead and discuss the basics of Splunk add-on for AWS. So the Splunk add-on for the Amazon Web Services allows Splunk software administrators to collect the AWS related data and the logs. So if you have multiple AWS environments and you want to fetch all of the data of AWS to Splunk, you will need to make use of the Splunk add-on for the Amazon Web Services. So as we were discussing in the earlier video as well, the overall architecture looks something similar to this. You have Splunk, you install the Splunk add-on for Amazon Web Services, and within this add-on, you go ahead and configure the credentials for your AWS account. And this add-on will connect to the AWS account using your credentials, and it will fetch the required logs and the data that you ask the add-on to fetch. Now, whenever you intend to use any add-on within Splunk, there are certain important checks that you need to make. The first important check states that the add-on must support your Splunk version. This is very important. Let's quickly look into it. So currently I'm in the Splunk base associated with our add-on of Amazon Web Services. And if you'll go a bit down, within the compatibility, you'll basically see the Splunk versions. So you have 8.1, 8.0, 8.2 and so on. So whenever you go ahead and install an add-on, make sure that it is compatible with the Splunk version that you are using. Some of the add-ons that you will see in Splunk base are only compatible with the older major version of Splunk. So let's say currently the major version of Splunk is Splunk 8. However, some of the add-ons only support Splunk 7. So this is one thing that you need to look into. The second very important check is to make sure that the hardware requirements required by the add-on is fulfilled by your Splunk Enterprise instance. Some of the add-ons really require a very good hardware. In terms of hardware, it basically relates to primarily the CPU and memory. However, some of the other add-ons, they do not really require a good hardware. So basically, whenever you explore a Splunk add-on, you can always go to the details. It will take you to the documentation associated with the add-on. And within the documentation, if you look into the hardware software requirements, as well as the sizing, performance and other considerations for the Splunk add-on on AWS. And within here, you'll basically get a reference architecture. So you have a reference hardware and software requirement, which is recommending M4.4x large, which has a memory of 64 GB and a vCPU of 16. Now do note, because this type of hardware is definitely required for the Splunk add-on for AWS, considering you're pulling a decent amount of data in a medium-sized organization. In fact, we used to have a server with more memory and CPU than the reference architecture here, while we were using the Splunk add-on for AWS, primarily because we had close to around 80 to 100 AWS accounts. So things used to be very slow if you go with a lower level of hardware. And the third check is the support type. So let's quickly go back to our Splunk add-on. So for the Splunk add-on for Amazon Web Services, you will see that it is built by Splunk and support is Splunk supported. So in case if things are not working as expected with your Splunk add-on, you can officially raise a ticket to the Splunk team, considering you have a support available, and then the Splunk team will look for it. Now this really matters for large enterprises. You will see certain unexpected errors, and when you have terabytes of data coming in from hundreds of AWS accounts, support is something that will always be beneficial. Great. So in today's video, we'll have some interesting practical as well. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and use a different hardware where we'll go ahead and install the Splunk add-on for AWS, and then we'll look into what happens if you install it in a hardware which is lower than one that is expected. So for example, our Splunk add-on for AWS will use two servers for installation. One server has 1 GB of RAM and second server has 4 GB of RAM. So these are two brand new servers that I have created for today's demo. So currently here you will see that I have two tabs. First one with the IP of 117. So this is a 1 GB RAM server, And the second one with the IP of 116, this is a 4 GB RAM server. So let me go ahead and install the add-on in the 1 GB RAM server, and let's look into what really happens here. So let's say Amazon Web Services. I'll install this add-on here. Let me add the credentials. I'll accept the terms and let's log in and install. And in a similar way, in our 4 GB RAM server as well, let's go ahead and install the Splunk add-on. Perfect. So within our 1 GB RAM server, our add-on has been successfully installed. Let's go back to the Splunk console. And here you see we have an add-on for AWS. Let's open this up. So one thing that you'll observe is that it immediately goes into the loading state. You will not really see the contents that are part of the add-on. In a similar way, in our 4 GB RAM server, let's go to the Splunk add-on. Let's open up our add-on for AWS. And within here, you'll see that our inputs page is loaded and we can go ahead and add new input. However, within our 1 GB RAM server, you will see the input page is not loading at all. So in case if you try to open this up in a different tab, let's open Splunk in a different tab here. You see the Splunk web UI is not loading at all. And this is the reason why it is very important for you to check the hardware requirements. Some of the add-on really require good amount of hardware. And if you install it in a 1 GB RAM server, things will go down. You will not even able to connect to the server. So this is one important part to note. Now, in case if you want to connect this add-on to AWS and look into how the data is fetched practically, I'll recommend you to launch at least a 4 GB RAM server, and then you can go ahead and do this practically. So anyways, our web UI of a 1 GB RAM server is not loading. Anyways, this was a test server primarily for this demo. I'll close this out. So within DigitalOcean, if you'll go ahead and quickly create a droplet here, you'll see under the regular Intel with SSD here, the 4 GB RAM and 2 CPU cost $0.030 per hour. So maybe you can go ahead and launch a droplet, use it for an hour or two, complete the practical, and then you can delete the droplet. So this is something that can be done. However, this is the minimum that is supported. Even if you use a 4 GB RAM server, the Splunk add-on will slow things down, but this is fine for our testing purposes. Now, as we are discussing, once we have the add-on, the next important part is your AWS account, and you need to connect your add-on with AWS. So within your add-on, if you'll go to the configuration page, and within here, you can go ahead and click on add, where you'll have to provide the access key ID and the secret key ID. So within your AWS console under the IAM service, let's create a new user. And within here, let's go ahead and create a new user here. The name of the user, let's just call it as Splunk. We'll give the access type of programmatic access. And within the permissions, we can go ahead and give a read-only access. Let's go a bit down. So you have this read-only access here. We'll give this policy and we'll create this user. So you get the access and secret key. Let's copy this up and let's paste it within the Splunk. Once done, you can click on add. Oops, we missed the field name. Let's just call it as Splunk temp user. All right, we'll do an add. Now, one important part to note is that if your environment is completely based on AWS, for example, your Splunk servers are also in the AWS environment and you are using the add-on of AWS, then it is recommended that you make use of a IAM role. So for this demo, I had created this server specifically in AWS to show you. So basically, one of the ways in which this add-on can connect to AWS is through the access and secret key. So this is good. However, the better way is to make use of a IAM role. So currently you see you also have a IAM role here. So if you'll go to the IAM role, you can go ahead and click on add, and here you can specify the IAM role of the destination AWS accounts, and you can get away without using the access and secret keys. However, we'll keep it simple and we'll make use of access secret keys to connect to our resources. So once our access and secret keys are configured in the Splunk add-on for Amazon Web Services, the next important part is what is the data that you want to collect. So if you'll see, there are hundreds of services in AWS. So what exactly you want to collect? And that is what you will be configuring within the inputs tab. Now do note that even with the 4 GB RAM server, there is a little lag in the loading of the add-on. So it might be a little slow, but quite good for a demo. So what you'll need to do is you'll have to create a new input. So let's go ahead and click here. And within here, depending upon the type of input that you need, you can select the appropriate option. For simplicity to verify if things are working, let's go ahead and select the description and the input type. Let's use the metadata Boto3. Within the name, let's just call it as temp description. Within the AWS account, you can go ahead and select our access secret key here, which is Splunk temp user. In case you have an IAM role, you'll also see an option something similar to this. So I'll use the access secret key based approach. Now in the next step, you'll have to select the region from which you want to collect the data. So let's assume that your entire infrastructure is based on the North Virginia region. You can select that. And now you'll have to select what are the things that you want to collect, whether you want to see EC2 related data, IAM, S3 buckets, VPCs, and so on. Now, one more very important part to remember here is the interval. Make sure that you do not really set a very low interval. If you select a low interval, then the Splunk add-on will try to collect the data at the interval level, and this will not only slow down your Splunk instance, but if your production environment is running in AWS and you have a very limited amount of API calls available, then your production environment can also go down. Alright, so generally in AWS, you have certain amount of API calls that you can make. However, if you have a very big environment, let's say 500 servers, 1000 servers, and there is huge amount of API calls that is already happening. And on top of that, using Splunk add-on, you set an interval like 60 seconds and Splunk add-on again will make a huge API call. Then the chances of your production environment going down is also quite high. Alright, so just select the interval accordingly. For our test environments, 3600 seconds is okay to begin with. Once done, you can go ahead and click on save. Alright, so our input is now created. So now Splunk add-on, with the help of our credentials, it will connect to the AWS and it will start to fetch the data. So what we'll do, let's go to the Splunk main console yet again. We'll go to the search and reporting app. Let's look into the data summary. Now at this stage, you will see that you have multiple sources of data as well as multiple source types. So the source type would be AWS metadata. However, depending upon the source like EC2 instance, the EC2 key pairs, security group, you will get the data accordingly. So let's look into, let's say we'll look into the security groups. Now here it will basically show you information related to the security groups that are available in the North Virginia region. So you have one group of default, you have one group called as Launch Wizard 7 and you have one group of Launch Wizard 1. It is also showing you the ingress as well as the egress permission. So ingress, you can see the port 80 is allowed, and if you explore more, the port 80 is allowed from 0000. Now, in fact, this is the same thing that you can see from the AWS console. In fact, let's open up the EC2 console here. So currently I'm in the North Virginia region. And if you'll go to the security group, let's go a bit down. So you have a security group here. Similar to what we were seeing in Splunk, there were 3 security groups here: default, Launch Wizard 7 and Launch Wizard 1. Now under the Launch Wizard 7, here it is showing port 80 TCP allowed for 0000. Let's verify for Launch Wizard 7 inbound rules. You see we have port 80 allowed for 0000 and we also have a port 22 allowed for a specific IP. Let's verify. So here you'll see we have port 22 and within the IP ranges, let's explore this. And you will see this is the same IP that you see over here. That's great. So I hope with this you understood the basics of Splunk add-on for AWS. We also looked into some of the important practical considerations while you are installing add-ons in Splunk. And after you have completed the practical, make sure that you go ahead and disable the add-on as well as disable the access and secret key so that it does not really get leaked at a later stage. So from our Splunk add-on, we can go ahead and disable this specific input. Along with this, you can also go ahead and disable the access secret key of the user. So what you can do is you can directly delete the user in case it is not really required. This is always the safer way. That's great. So with this, we'll conclude today's video.